Hi, I'm Sergeant Riley Thompson. For years, my sister Jessica mocked my National Guard service, calling me a pretend soldier who played dress up on weekends while she built a real career. She thought humiliating me about my fake military commitment would prove that serious people focused on actual jobs, not my weekend warrior fantasy. What she didn't know was that when Hurricane Katrina 2.0 devastated the Gulf Coast and trapped her in her luxury high-rise.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
The pretend soldiers she'd spent years mocking would become the only thing standing between her and a watery grave.
The uniform Jessica dismissed as playing army wasn't a costume. It represented 12 years of dedicated service with the Louisiana National Guard's 141st Field Artillery Regiment, where I'd earned my stripes through hurricane response, flood rescue operations, and disaster relief missions that saved thousands of lives across the Gulf Coast. My weekend warrior commitment meant monthly drill weekends, annual training exercises, and immediate activation during state emergencies. While Jessica saw me leaving for drill as abandoning real responsibilities, I was actually training for scenarios that could devastate our entire region. Storm surge operations, search and rescue protocols, and coordination with federal disaster response teams. The skills she mocked as playing soldier were specialized capabilities that civilian emergency services couldn't provide. High-water vehicle operation, tactical communication systems, logistics coordination under extreme pressure, and the physical and mental training required to operate in dangerous conditions where hesitation could cost lives. But to Jessica, none of that mattered. As Senior Marketing Director for Gulf Coast Luxury Properties, she measured success by six-figure salaries, corporate bonuses, and the kind of professional status that came with managing million-dollar real estate portfolios. Our family dinners had become showcases for her latest achievements, closing deals on waterfront condominiums, coordinating marketing campaigns for exclusive developments, and building relationships with wealthy clients who viewed hurricane risk as an acceptable trade-off for oceanfront luxury. Riley's still playing soldier, she'd tell our relatives during family gatherings, her voice carrying that particular tone of condescending amusement that suggested she was indulging a child's fantasy. She spends her weekends marching around and pretending to be important, while the rest of us focus on building actual careers with real responsibilities. The dismissal stung because it revealed how little she understood about what National Guard service actually entailed. While Jessica created marketing materials for luxury properties built in hurricane evacuation zones, I spent my time preparing for the inevitable disasters that would require military intervention when civilian resources were overwhelmed. My path to the National Guard had begun during college at LSU, where I'd studied emergency management while watching how Hurricane Katrina had exposed the gaps between civilian preparedness and actual disaster response capabilities. The Guard offered something civilian careers couldn't: the training, equipment, and authority to operate effectively during the worst emergencies our region could face. The specialization Jessica called weekend hobby had required years of advanced training. Swift water rescue certification, heavy equipment operation, emergency communications, and tactical medicine that prepared me to treat trauma injuries in field conditions where hospitals might be inaccessible or destroyed. Every drill weekend meant learning new skills or refreshing critical capabilities. Helicopter rescue operations, flood zone navigation, mass casualty triage, and coordination with federal disaster response teams. While Jessica spent her weekends showing luxury properties to wealthy buyers, I was preparing to save lives when those same properties became death traps during major storms. But Jessica saw none of that complexity. To her, I was the little sister who'd chosen a part-time military hobby instead of pursuing the corporate success that our parents valued. She measured worth by annual income and professional advancement, not by the lives protected or communities served during disasters that tested every aspect of emergency response. our parents had always encouraged achievement, but they struggled to understand how National Guard service constituted a real career when it didn't provide the financial rewards or social status that Jessica's marketing position offered. They supported my service in theory while questioning why I hadn't pursued full-time careers that would lead to better financial security. The upcoming hurricane season was predicted to be one of the most severe in decades, with meteorologists warning that a major storm could create catastrophic damage across the Gulf Coast. Jessica had dismissed these warnings as fear-mongering that hurts property values, focusing instead on closing deals before potential buyers were scared away by weather predictions. What she didn't understand was that her pretend soldier sister was about to become very real when nature tested every assumption about safety, preparedness, and what constituted truly important work.
Jessica and I had been inseparable as children, the kind of sisters who built blanket forts during thunderstorms and promised to always protect each other no matter what life brought our way. Growing up in suburban New Orleans, we'd weathered Hurricane Georges together, huddled in our parents' closet while wind howled outside and rain leaked through window sills that couldn't handle the storm's fury. When I grow up, I'm going to help people during hurricanes, I'd told Jessica during that long night in 1998, listening to emergency broadcasts and watching our father board windows with plywood that felt inadequate against nature's power. "Me too," she'd whispered back, holding my hand while we waited for the storm to pass. "We'll always help each other, no matter what." For years, our relationship had been built on mutual support and shared determination to make our parents proud after they'd lost everything in Hurricane Katrina and rebuilt their lives from nothing. Jessica excelled academically, earning scholarships and academic honors that led to her business degree at Tulane. I'd admired her intelligence, her ambition, and her ability to network with influential people who could help advance her career. "Riley's going to be just as successful as I am," Jessica would tell our parents' friends during family gatherings. "She's smart enough to do whatever she wants. We're both going to make something of ourselves and never have to worry about losing everything again like Mom and Dad did." But something had shifted when I chose military service over corporate career paths. Jessica couldn't understand why someone with my intelligence and opportunities would choose National Guard duty when I could be pursuing graduate school or entry-level positions at major corporations. "The Guard is fine as a college activity," she'd told me during my junior year at LSU, "but you need to think about your real career. Marketing, finance, maybe law school, something that builds toward actual financial security and professional advancement." The first signs of her changing attitude appeared when I completed basic training and advanced individual training for my military occupational specialty. Jessica expected military service to be a brief phase that would provide leadership experience for my eventual civilian career. Instead, I was embracing it as something more meaningful than temporary resume building. "Riley seems to think the National Guard is a real job," she'd started telling people, her tone suggesting that I was confused about professional priorities rather than committed to military service. "She's getting too invested in what should be a weekend hobby." Weekend hobby, as if preparing for disaster response and emergency rescue operations were equivalent to recreational activities rather than critical public service that protected our entire community. The relationship deteriorated further when I was promoted to sergeant and began taking leadership roles during training exercises and disaster preparedness drills. Jessica interpreted my military advancement as evidence that I was avoiding real-world challenges by pursuing success in an organization she considered less demanding than civilian employment. "It's easier to get promoted in the military because the standards aren't as high," she'd explained to anyone who congratulated me on my rank advancement. "Riley's good at following orders and wearing uniforms, but that's different from competing in actual business environments where performance really matters."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
During Hurricane Isaac in 2012, when my unit had been activated for flood rescue operations, Jessica had been more concerned about how my absence affected family dinner plans than about the families we'd evacuated from flooded neighborhoods.
She couldn't understand why I'd choose to spend days in dangerous conditions helping strangers instead of focusing on my own safety and civilian responsibilities. Riley thinks she's some kind of hero because she drives around in military trucks during storms. She's just avoiding real adult responsibilities by playing army when she should be building a career that actually matters. The relationship that had once been built on mutual support and shared goals had transformed into something more complicated. Jessica positioned herself as the responsible sister who'd made practical choices about career and financial security, while I was the idealistic sister who'd chosen military service over economic advancement and professional status that our parents could understand and celebrate.
The betrayal reached its peak during our family's annual Hurricane Katrina Remembrance Dinner, a solemn tradition where we honored the lives lost and the community rebuilt after the 2005 disaster. The gathering should have been about remembrance and gratitude, but Jessica chose that sacred evening to deliver the most devastating attack on my military service I'd ever experienced. The dinner was held at Commander's Palace, the iconic New Orleans restaurant that had become a symbol of the city's resilience after Katrina. Our extended family had gathered to share memories of survival, recovery, and the ongoing effort to build back stronger. These dinners were usually subdued affairs where we reflected on how fortunate we'd been to escape the storm's worst impacts. I'd just returned from a 2-week disaster response training exercise with FEMA, where National Guard units from across the Gulf Coast had practiced coordinated hurricane response protocols. The training had been intense and meaningful, preparing for scenarios that could save thousands of lives when the next major storm inevitably hit our region.
"Riley's been away playing soldier again," Jessica announced to the table, her voice cutting through conversations about family updates and community recovery projects. 2 weeks of taxpayer-funded summer camp where she gets to pretend she's important while the rest of us handle actual responsibilities. The comment landed like a slap across conversations about survival and community service. Our relatives stared in uncomfortable silence while Jessica continued her assessment of my training as if it were an elaborate vacation rather than emergency preparedness that could protect their lives. "Jessica, that's not appropriate," my Aunt Martha said quietly. But Jessica was just getting started. "I'm tired of pretending Riley's weekend warrior hobby is equivalent to real work," she continued, apparently deciding that our family's most sacred dinner was the perfect venue for this conversation. "She spends more time playing soldier than building an actual career, and we all act like it's meaningful when it's just an expensive game." Expensive game. During a dinner commemorating the hurricane that had killed over 1,800 people and displaced millions more, Jessica was characterizing disaster preparedness as recreational activity rather than the life-saving work that our community desperately needed. "The National Guard saved thousands of lives during Katrina," my father said, his voice carrying the strain of someone trying to maintain family peace while defending his daughter's service. "That was real soldiers, not weekend pretenders like Riley," she shot back, her voice rising with the kind of conviction that comes from believing your own narrative completely. "She's not a real soldier. She's a part-time amateur who thinks putting on a uniform makes her special." Part-time amateur. The words hit me like physical blows, reducing 12 years of dedicated service to a hobby pursued by someone too immature to choose serious career paths. But Jessica wasn't finished. She'd apparently prepared remarks for this moment, treating our family's remembrance dinner like a business presentation where she could present evidence of my professional inadequacy. "Riley could be making real money in marketing or business development," she told the table, as if my career decisions were appropriate dinner conversation during a memorial gathering. "Instead, she's wasting her intelligence on this military fantasy while pretending it's public service." Military fantasy? During a dinner honoring the real soldiers who'd risked their lives rescuing people from flooded neighborhoods, Jessica was dismissing National Guard service as elaborate make-believe, rather than the critical emergency response capability that had saved our city. The most devastating part of her attack was the timing and venue. She'd chosen our family's most solemn gathering, dedicated to honoring hurricane victims and community resilience, to deliver a calculated assault on my commitment to exactly the kind of service that made communities safer during disasters. Some of us choose careers that actually contribute to society, Jessica concluded, her voice carrying the finality of someone delivering a verdict. Riley chose to play dress-up and pretend she's protecting people when she's really just avoiding adult responsibilities. The betrayal was complete and public, delivered in front of family members who'd survived Hurricane Katrina and understood the value of emergency response, yet witnessed Jessica's systematic destruction of my military service during the one evening when such service should have been most respected and appreciated. The sister who'd once promised to always protect me had chosen our family's most sacred memorial dinner to humiliate me about the career I'd chosen specifically to protect others from the kind of devastation we were gathered to remember.
In the weeks following the Remembrance Dinner humiliation, Jessica launched a family-wide campaign to normalize her portrayal of my National Guard service as an expensive hobby that prevented me from pursuing serious career opportunities. Every family interaction became a chance to reinforce her narrative about my poor life choices and immaturity. Riley, still confused about what constitutes real work, became her standard explanation when relatives asked about my military service. We're hoping she'll eventually grow out of this phase and focus on building actual financial security through civilian employment. The term phase was particularly insidious because it suggested that 12 years of National Guard service was temporary rebellion rather than a deliberate commitment to protecting our community during emergencies. Jessica had effectively rebranded my military career as adolescent fantasy that the family should patiently tolerate until I matured enough to pursue legitimate employment. She began sharing carefully edited stories about my service that stripped away any context suggesting importance or value. When I mentioned participating in hurricane preparedness exercises, Jessica retold it to our parents as Riley's expensive camping trips where she gets to play with military trucks and avoid real job responsibilities. When I described the swift-water rescue training that could save lives during flood emergencies, Jessica translated it for family consumption as Riley learning to drive boats because she thinks it makes her look heroic. The most damaging aspect of her campaign was how she recruited other family members to participate in the dismissal. My cousin Michael, who worked in finance, started referring to my military service as Riley's government-subsidized adventure program. My Uncle Robert began asking patronizing questions about when I'd get serious about building wealth instead of playing soldier. It's sweet that Riley found something that makes her feel important, my Aunt Sarah would say with the kind of tone usually reserved for discussing children's pretend games. Not everyone can handle the pressure of real careers like Jessica's marketing position. Real careers, as if preparing for disaster response that could save thousands of lives during hurricane emergencies involved less pressure than creating advertising campaigns for luxury real estate developments. Jessica also began controlling the family narrative about our respective contributions to society. Her marketing work for luxury properties was presented as important economic development that supported local employment and tax revenue. My role in emergency preparedness was characterized as Riley's hobby that we support, even though it doesn't really accomplish anything meaningful. The financial comparisons became a constant theme. Jessica's annual salary is more than Riley makes from her part-time military service, my father would say during family gatherings, apparently unaware that National Guard compensation included benefits and training opportunities that didn't appear on simple pay stubs. But perhaps the most painful manipulation was how Jessica repositioned my commitment to physical fitness and emergency training as evidence of avoiding real-world responsibilities. My swift-water rescue certification became Riley playing in boats because she doesn't want a desk job. My emergency medical training was learning first aid because she thinks it makes her special. I worry that Riley's become addicted to the drama and attention of military service, Jessica confided to our mother during a conversation I overheard. She's built her whole identity around this fantasy of being some kind of hero, and now she doesn't know how to exist in the real world, where success requires actual business skills. The conversation positioned my career as psychological dysfunction rather than public service, suggesting that I needed intervention rather than support for choosing National Guard duty over corporate employment. Most devastatingly, she convinced our parents that encouraging my military service was enabling self-destructive behavior that prevented me from building financial security and professional advancement. The best thing we can do for Riley is stop pretending this military hobby is a real career, she told them. Maybe if we stop acting impressed by the weekend warrior games, she'll finally mature enough to pursue meaningful work that actually pays bills and builds toward retirement. By the time hurricane season arrived, with predictions of unprecedented storm activity, Jessica had spent months systematically undermining my credibility and positioning herself as the concerned sister trying to help me face reality about career choices that would never provide financial security or professional respect. None of them realized that the pretend soldiers they'd learned to dismiss were about to become the only people capable of saving their lives when nature tested every assumption about safety, preparedness, and what constituted truly essential work.
The awakening came during an emergency briefing at Jackson Barracks on August 23rd, when meteorologists presented data about Hurricane Maximus that would make Katrina look like a minor storm. I was sitting in the operations center surrounded by National Guard leadership, emergency management officials, and federal disaster coordinators who were preparing for what could become the most devastating natural disaster in American history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Martinez began, pointing to satellite imagery that showed a storm system of unprecedented size and intensity. "Hurricane Maximus is now a Category 5 storm with sustained winds of 185 miles per hour, heading directly for the Louisiana coast. We're looking at storm surge predictions of up to 35 feet in some areas." 35 feet of storm surge. The numbers were almost incomprehensible, representing water levels that would overtop every levee, flood every evacuation route, and turn most of southeast Louisiana into an inland sea where survival would depend entirely on emergency response capabilities that Jessica had spent months characterizing as expensive games. "The National Hurricane Center is calling this a potentially catastrophic and unsurvivable storm event," the colonel continued. "We're expecting complete infrastructure failure across a 6-parish area with rescue operations that will dwarf anything we've ever attempted." This was the moment when Jessica's weekend warrior narrative collided with reality. The skills she'd mocked as playing soldier were about to become the difference between life and death for thousands of people, including potentially our own family members who dismissed emergency preparedness as unnecessary paranoia. "Sergeant Thompson," Major Williams called out, recognizing my expertise in swift water rescue operations, "you'll be leading Team Alpha 7 for high-rise evacuations in the downtown corridor. Your team will have primary responsibility for luxury residential buildings that refused mandatory evacuation orders." High-rise evacuations. The kind of dangerous rescue operations that required exactly the specialized training Jessica had characterized as expensive hobbies. My swift water rescue certification, emergency medical training, and tactical communication skills were suddenly critical capabilities for saving lives in conditions that civilian emergency services couldn't handle. "Ma'am, what's our target area?" I asked, already knowing the answer would include the luxury developments where Jessica's real estate clients lived in buildings designed for prestige rather than hurricane safety. "Downtown core, including the Meridian Tower complex on Canal Street," Major Williams replied, showing aerial reconnaissance of the buildings where wealthy residents had ignored evacuation orders because they trusted engineering over meteorology. 40-story residential tower with approximately 200 people who refused to evacuate. Meridian Tower, Jessica's most successful real estate project, where she'd sold luxury condominiums to clients who valued waterfront views over hurricane safety. The building she'd marketed as hurricane-resistant luxury living was about to become a death trap where residents would depend on the same National Guard soldiers she'd spent years dismissing as pretend heroes. The National Hurricane Center is calling this a potentially catastrophic and unsurvivable storm event, Colonel Martinez continued. We're expecting complete infrastructure failure across a 6-parish area with rescue operations that will dwarf anything we've ever attempted. This was the validation I'd never sought but couldn't ignore. While Jessica had been dismissing National Guard service as avoiding real responsibilities, I'd been preparing for exactly this scenario, the kind of emergency where civilian services would be inadequate and military training would be the only thing standing between communities and catastrophic loss of life. Team leaders, understand that this operation will test every aspect of your training: swift water rescue, tactical medicine, emergency communications, and decision-making under extreme pressure. The skills you've developed during weekend drills and annual training exercises will determine how many people survive the next 72 hours. Weekend drills, annual training. The same activities Jessica mocked as expensive summer camp were suddenly revealed as life-saving preparation for disasters that could devastate our entire region. As I left the briefing to prepare my team and equipment, I realized that Jessica's mockery had inadvertently motivated me to pursue additional training and certifications that would make me more effective during this crisis. Her dismissal had pushed me to excel at exactly the skills that were about to save lives she never imagined were at risk. The pretend soldier she'd spent months humiliating was about to become very real when nature tested every assumption about safety, preparedness, and the value of military service during genuine emergencies.
Hurricane Maximus made landfall at 3:47 a.m. on August 25th, with sustained winds of 190 miles per hour and storm surge that turned downtown New Orleans into a war zone where only military-trained rescue teams could operate. By dawn, the luxury buildings Jessica had marketed as hurricane-safe had become islands surrounded by deadly currents that were claiming lives faster than civilian emergency services could count. Team Alpha 7, we have multiple distress calls from Meridian Tower, came the urgent radio transmission from our command center. Structure is taking severe damage, lower floors are flooding rapidly, and residents are trapped on upper levels with no evacuation route. This was the moment when Jessica's weekend warrior mockery met the brutal reality of Category 5 hurricane conditions. The building she'd sold as the pinnacle of hurricane-resistant luxury living was being systematically destroyed by storm surge and winds that exceeded every engineering assumption about survivable hurricane impacts. Roger Command, Team Alpha 7 is inbound for helicopter insertion, I replied, checking equipment that represented 12 years of specialized training Jessica had dismissed as expensive hobbies. Swift water rescue gear, emergency medical supplies, tactical communication equipment, and rope rescue systems that would be the only thing preventing mass casualties in conditions where civilian rescue services couldn't operate. The helicopter approach to Meridian Tower was unlike anything I'd experienced during training exercises. Wind gusts exceeding 160 miles per hour created turbulence that tested every aspect of our pilots' military aviation expertise, while debris fields of destroyed buildings created navigation hazards that required split-second decision-making under conditions that would ground civilian aircraft. 30 seconds to insertion, our pilot announced, fighting wind shear that could crash the helicopter if he lost concentration for even a moment. Weather window is closing fast. You'll have maybe 4 hours before extraction becomes impossible. 4 hours to evacuate 200 people from a 40-story building that was being systematically destroyed by hurricane conditions that exceeded every safety parameter used in its construction? The kind of high-pressure rescue operation that required exactly the specialized training Jessica had characterized as playing soldier. The rooftop insertion was conducted in sustained winds that made walking dangerous and communication nearly impossible without military-grade radio equipment. As my team established our command post, I could see the scope of destruction that had turned Jessica's luxury development into a disaster zone where survival would depend entirely on capabilities she'd spent months mocking.
Floor 36 is completely flooded, Specialist Martinez reported after our initial reconnaissance. We've got families trapped in upper floor units with no way down due to stairwell flooding and elevator failure. The tactical situation was exactly what our training had prepared us for. Complex rescue operations in hostile environmental conditions where every decision could mean the difference between saving lives and becoming casualties ourselves. While Jessica had been dismissing National Guard exercises as expensive summer camp, we'd been preparing for scenarios where preparation meant survival. Rodriguez and Chen established rope rescue systems for vertical evacuation, I commanded, deploying techniques that required months of specialized training to execute safely. Martinez and Wilson began medical triage for injured residents. Jackson and Foster established communication relay with command center. The operations that followed tested every aspect of training that Jessica had characterized as weekend hobbies: swiftwater rescue techniques to extract families from flooded apartments, emergency medical treatment for storm-related injuries in field conditions where hospitals were inaccessible, tactical communication to coordinate with other rescue teams operating across the disaster zone. But the most challenging aspect wasn't technical, it was psychological. Many of the residents we were rescuing had been among Jessica's clients, wealthy individuals who'd ignored evacuation orders because they trusted engineering over emergency management expertise and were now discovering that their luxury fortress had become a death trap. "Thank God you're here," sobbed Mrs. Henderson, a real estate investor who'd purchased 3 units in the building Jessica had marketed as hurricane-proof. "We thought the building would protect us. We didn't know it could get this bad." As I helped evacuate her family using rope rescue techniques that Jessica had mocked as playing army, I realized that the pretend soldiers she'd dismissed were literally the only people capable of saving lives when nature tested every assumption about safety, preparedness, and the value of military training during genuine emergencies. The execution phase of our rescue operation was proving that some weekend hobbies are actually preparation for moments when civilization depends on people who've dedicated their lives to being ready for the unthinkable.
My strategy for Hurricane Maximus was methodical and precise, leveraging 12 years of National Guard training that Jessica had dismissed as weekend hobbies, but would now determine who lived and who died during the most catastrophic storm in Gulf Coast history. The irony wasn't lost on me that her mockery had motivated me to pursue advanced certifications that would make the difference between successful rescues and tragic failures. Team Alpha 7, gather for final mission briefing. I called to my squad of 6 specialized rescue operators, each trained in swiftwater operations, tactical medicine, and high-angle rescue techniques that civilian emergency services couldn't attempt. These men and women represented the elite capabilities that Jessica had characterized as expensive games, but were actually the most sophisticated disaster response training available anywhere in the world. The tactical situation was unprecedented in its complexity and danger. Hurricane Maximus would make landfall in 18 hours with storm surge levels that would flood most evacuation routes within minutes of arrival. The luxury high-rise buildings where Jessica's clients lived would become isolated towers surrounded by deadly currents that could crush rescue boats and drown even experienced swimmers. "Our primary target is Meridian Tower," I explained, pointing to reconnaissance photos of the 40-story luxury residential building that had become Jessica's signature real estate success. 200 residents refused evacuation orders, believing the building's engineering would protect them from hurricane conditions. The building Jessica had marketed as hurricane-resistant luxury living was about to become a death trap, where wealthy residents would discover that prestige architecture couldn't withstand Category 5 storm surge and sustained winds that would shatter windows and flood lower floors with deadly speed. "Sergeant Thompson," Specialist Rodriguez asked, "what's our insertion method when ground-level access is impossible?"
Helicopter insertion onto the roof, then systematic floor-by-floor evacuation using high-angle rescue techniques, I replied, describing operations that required exactly the specialized training Jessica had mocked as playing soldier. We'll establish a command post on the top floor and work downward, prioritizing medical emergencies and families with children. The communication strategy was equally critical. Hurricane conditions would destroy cell towers and flood emergency dispatch centers, leaving military radio networks as the only reliable communication during rescue operations. The tactical communication skills that Jessica had dismissed as unnecessary complexity would become the lifeline connecting rescue teams with coordination centers. Weather conditions will deteriorate rapidly after landfall, I continued, reviewing meteorological data that showed sustained winds exceeding 150 miles per hour for over 6 hours. We'll have a narrow window for helicopter operations before conditions become unsurvivable even for military aircraft. But the most challenging aspect of the strategy was psychological preparation for rescuing people who dismissed the very capabilities that would save their lives. Jessica and her real estate clients had spent years minimizing hurricane risks to protect property values, ignoring evacuation orders because they trusted wealth and engineering over meteorology and emergency management expertise. Some of the people we're rescuing will be hostile or uncooperative. They'll blame us for the emergency, question our authority, or refuse to follow safety protocols because they don't understand the danger. Our job is to save their lives regardless of their attitude or cooperation level. The irony was perfect. Jessica had spent months positioning my National Guard service as evidence of avoiding real-world responsibilities. But this operation would require decision-making under pressure that her corporate crisis management experience couldn't have prepared her to handle. While she'd been creating marketing campaigns for luxury properties built in hurricane zones, I'd been preparing for the inevitable disasters that would test every assumption about safety, preparedness, and the value of military training during genuine life-or-death emergencies. Team, understand that everything we've trained for comes down to the next 72 hours. Swiftwater rescue, emergency medicine, tactical communication, and leadership under extreme pressure. The weekend drills and annual training exercises that civilians dismiss as playing soldier will determine how many people survive this storm. The pretend soldiers Jessica had mocked were about to demonstrate that some games are actually preparation for moments when preparation means the difference between families surviving together or never seeing each other again.
At 11:23 a.m., in the middle of evacuating the 32nd floor of Meridian Tower, my radio crackled with the transmission that would forever change my relationship with Jessica. Team Alpha 7, we have a priority rescue request. Jessica Thompson, 29th floor, Meridian Tower. She's trapped in her unit with rising water and requesting immediate evacuation. Jessica Thompson, my sister. The woman who'd spent years mocking my National Guard service as pretend soldier aims was now trapped in the very building she'd marketed as hurricane-proof luxury living, completely dependent on the weekend warriors she'd dismissed as avoiding real responsibilities. Rodriguez, take point on the stairwell descent, I commanded, my voice steady despite the irony of the situation. We have a family member trapped on 29, but she gets the same professional rescue protocol as every other civilian. The descent to Jessica's floor required every specialized skill she'd characterized as expensive hobbies: rope rescue techniques to navigate flooded stairwells, swift water operations to move through corridors filled with deadly currents, and emergency medicine training to treat storm-related injuries in conditions where hospitals were unreachable. Riley? Riley, is that you? Jessica's voice carried through her apartment door, stripped of the condescension that had characterized our relationship for years. The corporate executive who'd spent months positioning herself as more successful than her pretend soldier sister was now desperately calling for help from the very person she'd humiliated. Jessica, it's Sergeant Thompson with Louisiana National Guard rescue operations, I replied, maintaining professional protocol while conducting tactical assessment of her apartment's flood status. We're here to get you out safely.
When I breached her door using techniques learned during military training she'd mocked as playing Army, I found Jessica standing on her kitchen counter, surrounded by 4 feet of contaminated floodwater that was rising faster than civilian emergency services could respond. The luxury penthouse she'd used to showcase her real estate success had become a death trap where survival depended entirely on military rescue capabilities. "Riley, I'm so sorry," she sobbed, as my team secured her for rope evacuation. "I didn't know it would be this bad. I didn't know you were really trained for this." The transformation was immediate and complete. The woman who'd dismissed National Guard service as weekend warrior fantasy was now witnessing the life-saving reality of specialized military training during conditions that exceeded every civilian emergency response capability. "Ma'am, we need to move quickly," I said, fitting her with a rescue harness while explaining evacuation procedures. "The building's structural integrity is compromised, and weather conditions are limiting our extraction window." As my team conducted tactical evacuation procedures that required months of specialized training to execute safely, Jessica experienced firsthand the professional competence she'd spent years dismissing as expensive games. The rope rescue systems, emergency medical protocols, and tactical communication that had seemed like playing soldier were revealed as sophisticated life-saving capabilities. "I can't believe you do this," she whispered during our ascent to the helicopter extraction point. "I thought it was just weekend training. I didn't understand what you were really preparing for." The helicopter evacuation that followed demonstrated the full scope of capabilities Jessica had misunderstood. Military aviation expertise that could operate in conditions where civilian aircraft were grounded, coordination with federal disaster response agencies, and tactical medicine that kept storm victims alive during transport to overwhelmed medical facilities. "Team Alpha 7, successful extraction of priority civilian," I reported to command, as we lifted off from the Meridian Tower rooftop. "Victim is stable and en route to designated medical facility." Victim. Jessica had become another rescue statistic, completely dependent on the National Guard soldiers she'd characterized as pretend heroes playing expensive games with taxpayer money. "How many people have you saved today?" she asked, as we flew over the destruction that had turned her luxury development project into a disaster zone requiring military intervention. 43 confirmed rescues so far," I replied, focusing on tactical communication rather than the personal satisfaction of proving her wrong about military service. "We'll continue operations until weather conditions ground helicopter support." The reversal was complete. The sister who'd mocked my weekend warrior commitment was now alive because of the very training she'd dismissed, witnessing firsthand the professional competence that separated military rescue operations from civilian emergency services during catastrophic disasters. Jessica's luxury lifestyle and corporate success had been powerless against Category 5 hurricane conditions, while the pretend soldiers she'd ridiculed had become the only people capable of saving her life.
3 years after Hurricane Maximus, I stood before a packed auditorium at the National Guard Association's annual conference, receiving the Distinguished Service Medal for leading rescue operations that saved over 300 lives during the most catastrophic natural disaster in American history. The audience included military leadership, disaster response coordinators, and emergency management professionals from across the country, all gathered to honor the Guard units that had proven the critical value of citizen soldiers during domestic emergencies. Jessica sat in the front row, now serving as executive director of the Gulf Coast Disaster Preparedness Foundation we'd established together. The corporate executive who'd once dismissed National Guard service as weekend warrior games had become one of the country's leading advocates for military disaster response capabilities and emergency preparedness education. The Hurricane Maximus response demonstrated that our nation's security depends not just on overseas military operations, but on domestic capabilities that protect communities when natural disasters overwhelm civilian resources, I told the audience, clicking to a slide showing before and after photos of the devastation that had tested every aspect of our training. The foundation had revolutionized how communities approached hurricane preparedness, combining Jessica's corporate communication skills with my military expertise to create programs that bridged the gap between emergency management theory and practical survival during catastrophic storms.
We've trained over 100,000 residents in basic disaster preparedness and evacuation procedures, I continued, describing programs that had grown from the lessons learned during Maximus. But more importantly, we've changed the conversation about who protects communities during emergencies and why military training matters for domestic security. Our program had become the national model for disaster preparedness education because it addressed the fundamental misunderstanding that had nearly cost Jessica her life, the assumption that wealth, engineering, and civilian emergency services could handle any crisis that nature might create. The media attention following Maximus had transformed both our careers in ways neither of us had anticipated. I'd been promoted to major and was now consulting with FEMA on National Guard integration with federal disaster response protocols. My expertise in urban rescue operations during extreme weather had made me a sought-after instructor for emergency management agencies worldwide. But perhaps the most satisfying triumph was Jessica's complete transformation from skeptic to advocate. Her corporate background had proven invaluable for translating military capabilities into language that civilian audiences could understand and support, while her personal experience during Maximus gave her credibility that no theoretical knowledge could provide. "Riley saved my life," Jessica told CNN during our first joint interview after the storm. "I spent years thinking her National Guard service was just expensive playing, but when a Category 5 hurricane turned my luxury building into a death trap, her weekend warrior training was the only thing standing between me and drowning." The Hurricane Maximus rescue operations had been documented as a case study in military disaster response, required reading at the National War College, and emergency management programs nationwide. The weekend drills and annual training exercises that Jessica had mocked as expensive summer camp were now recognized as critical preparation for domestic security operations. A relationship had been completely rebuilt on mutual respect and shared mission rather than professional competition. Jessica now understood that her sister's military service involved capabilities that her corporate experience couldn't evaluate, while I'd learned that her business skills could be essential for building public support for National Guard disaster response funding. The book we'd co-authored, When the Levees Break, Military Response to Domestic Disasters, had become required reading for emergency management professionals and influenced federal policy on National Guard funding and training priorities. But the most meaningful triumph was personal. The family dynamics that had been poisoned by years of professional dismissal had been healed through shared commitment to protecting communities from the kind of disasters that test every assumption about safety, preparedness, and what constitutes truly essential work. The sister I once mocked as a pretend soldier became the most real thing in my life when everything else I trusted, wealth, engineering, civilian emergency services, proved powerless against nature's fury. Sometimes the people who dismiss you most completely become your greatest advocates once they understand what they were too ignorant to recognize initially. And sometimes, natural disasters provide the perfect classroom for teaching lessons about what really matters when civilization faces its ultimate tests.
Standing in my daughter Emma's nursery 5 years later, looking at the framed photo of Jessica and me during Hurricane Maximus rescue operations, I finally understood the profound gift her mockery had given me. Her years of dismissing my National Guard service as pretend soldier games had pushed me to pursue advanced training and certifications that ultimately saved hundreds of lives, including her own. Emma, now 3 years old with her father's gentle nature and my stubborn determination, discovered me studying the image one evening as I prepared for a speech at the Army War College about the psychology of disaster preparedness and community resilience. "Mommy, why did Aunt Jessica used to be mean about your soldier clothes?" she asked with the innocent directness that cuts through adult complications to reach essential truths. I'd been dreading this conversation, knowing that eventually I'd need to explain why her aunt had once dismissed her mother's military service, why family relationships sometimes require fundamental transformation before they become healthy, why some lessons can only be learned through experiences that test every assumption about safety and preparedness.
Sometimes, sweetheart, people don't understand that different kinds of work are important in different ways, I said, lifting her onto my lap, while she played with her toy rescue helicopter, a gift from Jessica, who now understood the life-saving importance of military aviation. Aunt Jessica thought my soldier job wasn't real because she didn't know what soldiers really do. But now she knows? Emma asked with the logical progression that children apply to complex situations. Now she knows that soldiers practice helping people so they're ready when people really need help. What Jessica's years of dismissal had taught me was the difference between perceived importance and actual value, between social recognition and meaningful contribution. True purpose, I'd learned, wasn't determined by external validation or professional status, but by the intersection of personal commitment, specialized competence, and readiness to serve when communities face their greatest challenges. The wisdom I'd gained from her mockery extended far beyond personal vindication. Through the foundation and our disaster preparedness work, I'd seen how societal misconceptions about military service prevented communities from understanding the capabilities that could save their lives during catastrophic emergencies. One of the most important lessons I've learned, I told audiences at emergency management conferences, is that the work we dismiss as unnecessary or irrelevant is often the work that matters most when comfortable assumptions about safety and security collapse under the weight of real crisis. This perspective had transformed how we approached community disaster education. Instead of teaching fear or dependency, we taught practical preparation and confident response. We helped families understand that being ready for emergencies didn't mean living in constant anxiety. It meant living with the confidence that came from knowing you could protect what mattered most when systems failed. Jessica's transformation from skeptic to advocate had become a powerful teaching tool for reaching audiences who might dismiss emergency preparedness advice from military professionals. Her corporate background and personal experience during Maximus allowed her to speak credibly to business communities about risks they'd preferred to ignore and capabilities they'd never considered valuable. I spent years making fun of my sister's National Guard service, she would tell audiences at our joint presentations. I thought it was a waste of time and money until the night it saved my life. Now I understand that some preparation looks like playing until the moment when playing becomes the difference between living and dying. Our relationship had been rebuilt on mutual respect and shared understanding of what constituted real strength and genuine service. Jessica now understood that her sister's military commitment involved responsibilities and capabilities that her corporate experience hadn't prepared her to evaluate, while I'd learned that her business expertise could be essential for building community support for disaster preparedness initiatives. But perhaps the most profound wisdom came from understanding that sometimes the people who challenge us most severely are providing exactly the motivation we need to achieve excellence beyond what we thought possible. Jessica's mockery had driven me to pursue training that exceeded minimum requirements, certifications that prepared me for worst-case scenarios, and leadership roles that tested every aspect of my capabilities. The sister who'd called me a pretend soldier had inadvertently motivated me to become more real than either of us had imagined possible. And sometimes the most devastating criticism becomes the most powerful catalyst when it forces you to prove doubters wrong through excellence they couldn't envision.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.